Margaret is lying on a wooden table in a stone room beneath a monastery in London. She is 24 years old. She has been brought here by her husband, a wool merchant, who told the monks that his wife suffers from hysteria, episodes of weeping, refusal to eat, resistance to his authority in the household. He wants her cured. The man standing over her is not a physician in any sense a modern person would recognize. He is a cleric who has studied texts attributed to ancient Greek authorities, but who has never examined a living woman's body. He does not know what organs she contains. He does not know how they function. He has read that the organ responsible for carrying children is not fixed in place, but moves freely through the body like a living creature. That when it migrates upward toward the throat, it presses on the lungs and produces the condition the texts call hysteria, from the Greek word for that organ. His treatment plan follows the established protocol. Force the organ back into its proper position through a combination of foul-smelling substances held beneath the woman's nose to repel it downward, and fragrant substances applied to her lower body to attract it. If this method fails, he will proceed to fumigation, inserting a tube and directing the smoke of burning herbs into the most private areas of her body to stimulate the organ into movement. If fumigation fails, manual manipulation through the abdominal wall. If manipulation fails, bleeding. If bleeding fails, purgatives that will force her body to void whatever corrupt matter is preventing the organ from settling. Margaret is restrained on the table, not because she is violent, but because the treatments she is about to undergo produce involuntary movement that interferes with the practitioner's work. Leather straps across her arms and legs, tightened by an assistant who performs this task regularly enough that his hands move without hesitation. Margaret is looking at the ceiling. The stone is damp. The room smells of smoke and something acidic that she cannot identify. The man above her is preparing his instruments with the calm efficiency of a person who believes completely in the value of what he is about to do. What was about to happen to Margaret was not malpractice. It was medicine. The standard of care prescribed by the most respected medical authorities in the Western world, practiced for centuries across every country in Europe on women whose bodies were understood through a framework so fundamentally wrong that every treatment it produced caused harm and no treatment it produced provided benefit. The men who administered these treatments were not sadists. They were professionals, trained at the finest institutions their civilization maintained. Operating from textbooks endorsed by the church and the universities and every authority that medieval society recognized, they believed they were healing. The women on their tables knew otherwise. But the women on the tables were not the ones writing the textbooks. Before I show you what happened to Margaret on that table, before I reveal the full catalog of what medieval medicine did to women's bodies in the name of care, I need to take you back. I need to show you how an entire civilization built a medical system around beliefs about women's bodies that were not merely wrong, but designed from their very foundations to classify femaleness itself as a disease requiring treatment. Because what happened in that stone room was not an aberration. It was the logical product of 1,000 years of medical theory that began with a simple premise: women's bodies were broken. And the men who studied those bodies without ever understanding them appointed themselves to fix what was never broken in the first place. You might assume that medieval medicine was simply primitive, that the physicians of the 12th and 13th centuries were doing their best with limited knowledge, making honest mistakes in an era before microscopes and anatomy textbooks and the scientific method. For men's medicine, that assumption is partially true. Medieval physicians treated broken bones, fevers, and battlefield wounds with methods that were crude but often grounded in practical observation. They set fractures. They cauterized wounds. They learned through trial and error which herbs reduced fever and which poultices prevented infection. The medicine was rough, but it was connected, however loosely, to reality. For women, the medicine was connected to something else entirely. It was connected to a set of beliefs about the female body that were not merely inaccurate, but actively hostile. Beliefs that classified women's bodies as defective versions of men's bodies. Beliefs that treated femaleness itself as a medical condition, a chronic disorder of constitution that required constant management by male authorities who understood what women's bodies needed better than the women who inhabited them. The foundation was Galen, a Greek physician of the 2nd century whose theories about the human body dominated European medical thought for over 1,000 years. Galen's system classified all matter, including human bodies, according to 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was a balance of these humors. Illness was an imbalance. So far, the theory applied equally to men and women. But Galen added a distinction that would shape the suffering of women for a millennium. Men were hot and dry. Women were cold and wet. This was not a neutral classification. In the humoral framework, hot and dry meant active, strong, rational, complete. Cold and wet meant passive, weak, emotional, incomplete. The female body was literally defined as an inferior version of the male body, lacking the vital heat that would have made it whole. Every medical treatment designed for women began from this premise. The female body was inherently disordered. Its coldness made it accumulate substances that a man's heat would have burned away. Its wetness made it unstable, prone to fluctuations that produced unpredictable symptoms. Its fundamental incompleteness meant that it required external management to function at even a basic level. The physician who treated a man was correcting a temporary imbalance in an otherwise sound system. The physician who treated a woman was managing a permanent deficiency built into her very nature. If you want to understand the full horror of what this framework produced, the treatments it justified, the suffering it caused, the centuries of damage inflicted on women's bodies by men who called themselves healers, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button because what I am about to reveal is not ancient history in the comfortable sense. The assumptions that medieval medicine built into its treatment of women persisted for centuries. Some of them persist today in examination rooms and hospitals, in the documented disparity between how seriously men's pain and women's pain are taken by modern physicians. The stone room where Margaret lies strapped to a table is not as far away as you think. Stay until the end, because the connection between what was done to her and what continues to be done will change how you understand the history of medicine forever. The fundamental problem that shaped everything was this: men controlled the medical treatment of women's bodies despite knowing almost nothing about them. And the systems that maintained their ignorance were the same systems that maintained their authority. The medieval church prohibited the dissection of human bodies for most of the period. Exceptions existed, and by the 13th century, some Italian universities had begun performing limited anatomical studies. But these dissections were overwhelmingly performed on male bodies. The female body remained largely unexamined from the inside. The physicians who treated women worked not from observation but from texts, Galen, Hippocrates, Aristotle, men who had written centuries earlier, who had never opened a woman's body to study its structures, and whose theories about female anatomy were speculations built on the assumption that women were simply incomplete men. The texts taught that the organs responsible for carrying children were not fixed in place, that they moved through the body independently, like an animal trapped inside a larger animal, migrating upward or downward in response to stimuli that the physician could manipulate. This theory, which originated with Hippocrates and was elaborated by Galen and adopted without question by medieval physicians, was the foundation of women's medicine for over 1,000 years. It was never tested. It was never verified through examination. It was never challenged by observation, because the people who might have challenged it, the women who lived inside the bodies being described, were excluded from every institution where medical knowledge was produced and transmitted. Women were barred from universities. They were barred from medical schools. They could not study the texts that described their own bodies. They could not practice medicine legally in most of medieval Europe. The exclusion was enforced by law and by the church, which viewed female participation in medicine as a violation of the natural order that placed men in authority over women's bodies, the same way it placed men in authority over women's souls. A woman who treated another woman's illness was not practicing medicine. She was trespassing on male territory. The penalties ranged from fines to imprisonment to, in later centuries, accusations of witchcraft that could end at the stake. This meant that the people experiencing the conditions were barred from studying or treating them. The only people authorized to treat women's bodies were people who had never inhabited a woman's body, who had never experienced the conditions they were treating, and whose understanding of female anatomy came entirely from texts written by other men who had never examined a female body from the inside. The result was a medical system built on a closed loop of male ignorance, reinforcing male authority. The texts said the female body worked in a certain way. The physicians treated women based on what the texts said. When the treatments failed, the failure was attributed to the woman's body rather than to the physician's understanding. The texts were never wrong. The woman's body was always the problem. And since the woman could not challenge the texts, could not study them, could not practice the medicine that was being practiced on her, the loop continued